You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. Today, we've compiled for you this month's selected weird tales. 4 obscure horror stories, first published in February editions of Weird Tales magazine. We hope you enjoy them. Night and Silence by Maurice Lavelle. They were old, crippled, horrible. The woman hobbled about on 2 crutches. One of the men, blind, walked with his eyes shut, his hands outstretched, his fingers spread open. The other, a deaf mute, followed with his head lowered, rarely raising the sad, restless eyes that were the only sign of life in his impassive face. It was said that they were 2 brothers and a sister, and that they were united by a savage affection. One was never seen without the other. At the church doors they shrank back into the shadows, keeping away from those professional beggars who stand boldly in the full light so that passers-by may be ashamed to ignore their importunacy. They did not ask for anything. Their appearance alone was a prayer for help. As they moved silently through the narrow, gloomy streets, a mysterious trio, they seemed to personify age, night, and silence. One evening, in their hovel near the gates of the city, the woman died peacefully in their arms, without a cry, with just one long look of distress which the deaf mute saw, and one violent shudder which the blind man felt because her hand clasped his wrist. Without a sound, she passed into eternal silence. Next day, for the first time, the 2 men were seen without her. They dragged about all day without even stopping at the baker's shop where they usually received doles of bread. Toward dusk, when lights began to twinkle at the dark crossroads, when the reflection of lamps gave the houses the appearance of a smile, they bought, with the few halfpence they had received, 2 poor little candles, and they returned to the desolate hovel where the old sister lay on her pallet, with no one to watch or pray for her. They kissed the dead woman. The man came to put her in her coffin. The deal boards were fastened down, and the coffin was placed on 2 wooden trestles. Then, once more alone, the 2 brothers laid a sprig of boxwood on a plate, lighted their candles, and sat down for the last all-too-short vigil. Outside, the cold wind played around the joints of the ill-fitting door. Inside, the small trembling flames barely broke the darkness with their yellow light. Not a sound. For a long time they remained like this, praying, remembering, meditating. Tired out with weeping, at last they fell asleep. When they woke, it was still night. The lights of the candles still glimmered, but they were lower. The cold that is the precursor of dawn made them shiver. But there was something else. What was it? They leaned forward, the one trying to see, the other to hear. For some time they remained motionless. Then, there being no repetition of what had roused them, they lay down again and began to pray. Suddenly, for the second time, they sat up. Had either of them been alone, he would have thought himself the plaything of some fugitive hallucination. When one sees without hearing or hears without seeing, illusion is easily created. But something abnormal was taking place. There could be no doubt about it, since both were affected. Since it appealed both to eyes and ears at the same time, they were fully conscious of this, but were unable to understand. Between them, they had the power of complete comprehension. Singly, each had but a partial, agonizing conception. The deaf mute got up and walked about. Forgetting his brother's infirmity, the blind man asked in a voice choked with fear, "What is it? What's the matter? Why have you got up?" He heard him moving, coming and going, stopping, starting off again, and again stopping. And having nothing but these sounds to guide his reason, his terror increased till his teeth began to chatter. He was on the point of speaking again, but remembered and relapsed into a muttering. "What can he see? What is it?" The deaf-mute took a few more steps, rubbed his eyes, and presumably reassured, went back to his mattress and fell asleep. The blind man heaved a sigh of relief, and silence fell once more, broken only by the prayers he mumbled in a monotonous undertone, his soul benumbed by grief, as he waited till sleep should come and pour light into his darkness. He was almost sleeping, when the murmurs which had before made him tremble wrenched him from an uneasy doze. It sounded like a soft scratching mingled with light blows on a plank, curious rubbings and stifled moans. He leaped up. The deaf-mute had not moved. Feeling that the fear that culminates in panic was threatening him, he strove to reason with himself. Why should this noise terrify me? The night is always full of sounds. My brother is moving uneasily in his sleep. Yes, that's it. Just now I heard him walking up and down, and there was the same noise. It must have been the wind. But I know the sound of the wind, and it has never been like that. It was a noise I had never heard. What could it have been? No, it could not be. He bit his fists. An awful suspicion had come to him. Suppose... No, it's not possible. Suppose it was... There it is again. Again. Louder and louder. Someone is scratching, knocking. My God. A voice. Her voice. She is calling. She is crying. Help! Help! He threw himself out of bed and roared, "Francois, quick! Help! Look!" He was half mad with fear. He tore wildly at his hair, shouting, "Look! You've got eyes! You can see!" The moans became louder, the raps firmer. Feeling his way, stumbling against the walls, knocking against the packing cases which served as furniture, tripping in the holes in the floor, he staggered about, trying to find his sleeping brother. He fell and got up again, bruised, covered with blood, sobbing, "I have no eyes! I have no eyes!" He had upset the plate on which lay the sprig of box, and the sound of the earthenware breaking on the floor gave the finishing touch to his panic. "Help! What have I done? Help!" The noises grew louder and more terrifying, and as an agonized cry sounded, his last doubts left him. Behind his empty eyes, he imagined he saw the horrible thing. He saw the old sister beating against the tightly closed lid of her coffin. He saw her superhuman terror, her agony, 1,000 times worse than that of any other death. She was there, alive. Yes, alive, a few steps away from him. But where? She heard his steps. His voice, and he, blind, could do nothing to help her. Where was his brother? Flinging his arms from right to left, he knocked over the candles. The wax flowed over his fingers, hot, like blood. The noise grew louder, more despairing. The voice was speaking, saying words that died away in smothered groans. "Courage!" he shrieked. "I'm here! I'm coming!" He was now crawling along on his knees, and a sudden turn flung him against a bed. He thrust out his arms, felt her body, seized it by the shoulders and shook it with all the strength that remained in him. Violently awakened, the deaf-mute sprang up, uttering horrible cries and trying to see. But now that the candles were out, he too was plunged into night, the impenetrable darkness that held more terror for him than for the blind man. Stupefied with sleep, he groped about wildly with his hands, which closed in a vice-like grip on his brother's throat, stifling cries of, "Look! Look!" They rolled together on the floor, upsetting all that came in their way, knotted together, ferociously tearing each other with tooth and nail. In a very short time, their hoarse breathing had died away. The voice, so distant and yet so near, was cut short by a spasm. There was a cracking noise. The imprisoned body was raising itself in one last supreme effort for freedom. A grinding noise. Sobs. Again the grinding noise. Silence. Outside, the trees shuddered as they bowed in the gale. The rain beat against the walls. The late winter's dawn was still crouching on the edge of the horizon. Inside the walls of the hovel, not a sound, not a breath. Night and silence. Piecemeal by Oscar Cook. Warwick put down his drink, lighted a cigarette, looked round the club smoking room to discover that, in our corner at least, we were alone. Then, leaning toward me, he asked in that abrupt, disturbing manner of his, "What happened to Mendingham?" I was startled. The more so as, at that moment, the threatening storm broke with a streak of forked lightning and a clap of thunder that seemed right overhead. Then the deluge came. I looked at Warwick with a feeling of dismay, for I knew the expression on his face, the set of his lips and jaw, and the curious rigidity that somehow seemed to stiffen even his ears. There was no gainsaying him. If he meant to learn Mendingham's fate, nothing I could say would put him off. Also, as it happened, we both had time hanging on our hands. And yet, it was on just such a night as this, stormy, wild, filthy, in sailor parlance, that I found him. The memory of that discovery would never die, but a storm always accentuated it. "What happened?" Warwick repeated. "Out with the story, for I mean to know. I'm hard up for copy, and the stream of ideas is low. They're bread and butter to me in the writing trade, so—" The gesture of his hands was more eloquent than words. I signed to him to draw his chair closer, and called a waiter to replenish our glasses. Then, and not till then, I began the story. "I'm going to tell you, Warwick," I began, "one of the most gruesome stories the world has ever known." He rubbed his hands together and looked pleased. "So gruesome," I went on, "that I won't even extract from you a promise not to make use of it, for I feel certain you'll never want to write it up. You remember Gregory?" "Yes," Warwick nodded. "Met him quite a lot at one time. Then he too seemed to fade away. He'd a most wonderfully and gorgeously beautiful wife." "Exactly. She was the cause of the mystery." Warwick chuckled. "Then there was a mystery." "I thought so." "Yes, but not in the way you imagine. You went abroad a good while before their divorce case." "Cherchez la femme. I always thought Gregory too careless and too cold-blooded to have such an attractive piece of goods about. He was asking for trouble." "Perhaps, but Mendingham was after all his greatest friend." "And thundering good-looking, with a taking air and an eye for the ladies, eh?" "As you say, but that's no excuse. Mendingham was a friend of mine, but I can't hold him guiltless in this matter. Some things just aren't done." "Such as?" "Making love to and running off with your best friend's wife, even if she weren't happy with her husband." Warwick gave vent to a low whistle. "That was at the bottom of the trouble, was it?" he stated, rather than asked. I nodded, and he went on. "Well, I'm not surprised. What did and still does surprise me is how on earth Moira married Gregory. He was a queer fish always, a great brain full of medicine and surgical ideas, but the coldest, most calculating human being I've ever met. And I've traveled a lot and met some. Ever seen him in the operating theatre?" I started. He put the question with that sudden disconcerting manner of his. It almost made me think he knew more than he admitted, while it brought back with redoubled intensity that awful final scene when— But I'm rattling on too fast. I took a long pull at my whiskey and soda. Warwick saw my agitation and smiled. "Don't worry," he said. "Tell me the story in your own way. From now on I'll try and not interrupt, but for heaven's sake, man, keep the tension strong and hot. At present you're about as exciting as Tennyson's Brook." I made no comment. The desire for super-horrors among the present-day host of sensation-mongers masquerading as journalists, once members of an honorable profession, is beyond my power of speech. Instead, I settled down as comfortably as my own prickly memories and the raging storm would let me to tell the story in my own way. And I must admit that it was a relief to get the gruesome tragedy off my chest, for up to now I'd shared a solitary secret, as the affair was somehow kept out of the press. Gregory had planned a great tour, I began, into the heart of Dutch Borneo, one of the few places of the earth today still really unknown. He was intrigued with the idea of finding the race of natives, the most backward in the world, which is reputed to be possessed of tails not less than 3 inches long, who live in trees and who still practice cannibalism. He was going alone. That is, Moira was not to accompany him. It was no journey for her. Warwick smiled his cynical grin. Mendingham's opportunity. I paid no heed. Gregory was away a little over a year. On his return, he wirelessed Moira 2 days out of Liverpool to meet him. She was not at the quayside when the steamer berthed. Arrived in London, he went straight to his house in Harley Street. It was shut up and showed no sign of life. He got in with his own key. Most of the furniture was gone. Only his bedroom, consulting room, and smoking room were furnished. The house was otherwise completely empty. More, it was thick with dust. That night he slept at his club and early the next morning went round to the house agents. They knew nothing, save that the rent had been regularly paid by a cheque from the bank. The bank and solicitors could be no more explanatory or communicative. I paused to light a cigarette, and in doing so took a long look at Warwick. He was thrilled. There was no mistaking the expression of beatific glee on his face as he listened to the sensational tragedy of his one-time friend. "When did you learn all this?" he asked. "From Gregory himself," I answered, having blown out the match. "I saw a lot of him in the time that followed, when he was hunting for his wife." "And Mendingham?" Warwick pointedly asked. "That's what gave him the clue. Mendingham was absent quite a lot from his favourite haunts, and when they met he seemed distrait. What gave Gregory an inkling was the fact that Mendingham never once mentioned Moira's name, whereas previously he had always asked after her and joked about her being Beauty and Gregory the Beast. Gregory put a detective onto him. The rest was easy. They were living together in a minute, lonely cottage in the New Forest." Warwick took a long gulp at his drink. "Cut the cackle and get to the 'osses," he snapped as he put the glass down. "You can skip the intervening bit. I can find it any day in the back files of any newspaper catering for the public that likes spice, like the little girl with her new storybook. I want to hear the end." At that moment, the little liking I ever had for Warwick nearly died. He was positively reveling in anticipatory horrors. It revolted me. It was, however, my turn to smile. "You'd searched the papers in vain," I said, rather acidly. The suit was undefended, so there was nothing to report. It was from that time onward, though, that things began to happen. In due time, the decree was made absolute, and Mendingham and Moira married and even talked of coming back to town. "And Gregory?" Warwick interpolated with that almost fiendish quickness of his for seizing upon the heart of a story. "Gregory," I continued slowly, "was gradually becoming a recluse. He gave up coming to the club, sold the lease of his house, and acquired a dilapidated houseboat on a little-known and unfrequented backwater on the Thames. Here he did for himself. Once a week brought his stores from the village, and in this seclusion wrote the magnum opus, an account of his Dutch Borneo trip. From the point of view of ethnology, it is unsurpassed." "You've read it?" Warwick shot the question at me. "Of course. Then for some time I practically lost all touch with him. though I occasionally saw the other two, who were tremendously happy. Moira absolutely adored Mendingham. Then one day I heard from Gregory that he was going abroad. I asked him to dine with me on his last night in England, but he refused, and I never saw him again, until just then a terrific clap of thunder made me start, and I spilt a lot of my drink. Warwick was frankly impatient. "It is certain," I continued, "that he bought tickets for the Congo, but whether he went is another matter. All I know is that as far as I am concerned, and others interested in him also, he completely disappeared into the blue." "A monomaniac nursing his grievance," Warwick sneered. "What an end to a great brain. But where does Mendingham fit in with all this?" His devilish persistence annoyed me. "I'm coming to that now," I answered. "Only for God's sake, don't interrupt." It was nearly 3 months after Gregory supposedly went abroad that Mendingham became missing. "You mean dead?" Warwick asked. I turned on him in fury. "No," I snapped. "I don't. I mean missing. He went out one morning as usual and was never seen again." "Never?" Warwick's eyes were bulging out of his head, and he was breathing hard in his excitement. "Not till I found him," I answered slowly. "Or, to be accurate, his remains, the little that was left of him." "A rotten mass of decomposing flesh, or just dried bones?" Warwick asked, almost licking his lips in ecstasy. "Neither," I replied, and then lapsed into silence, as the poignant memory coupled with a nausea for the human ghoul alongside me nearly proved more than I could bear. At length, however, I was able to continue, strengthened by the desire to share at last my terrible secret. Moira, as you may imagine, was frantic, and the strain and suspense nearly killed her, but she survived, chiefly, I think, on account of an indomitable desire to get to the bottom of the mystery. There was no question, you must understand, of desertion for another woman. Mendingham was this time really and truly in love. I saw a lot of Moira during this time, and helped all I could, but all in vain. The police, the wireless, the motor associations, all were roped in, all did their utmost, but Mendingham was not to be found. Not a trace. Warwick's tone was a mixture of skepticism and glee. Not a trace, but rumours by the score. He had been seen in every part of England, every report and identification tallied, yet it was never he. There must be hundreds of doubles in the country, were it known. The next item of interest, at the time seeming quite irrelevant, was Gregory's return. This was about a month, a little less perhaps, after Mendingham's disappearance. Though not really sociable as of old, he was not so hermit-like as before he went abroad. He took a room at his club and was seen now and again about town, a theatre, an exhibition and such like. But he still owned the houseboat, where he admitted to spending a lot of time. About 3 days after his return, Moira telephoned me. She was hysterical. That was clear over the wire. She wanted me to go round to her at once. She had I never heard what, for her voice died away in a choking groan. I hurried round. She was beside herself. She couldn't speak, but with white frozen face, with wide-open eyes and bloodless lips, she pointed to a parcel that lay open on the divan in her drawing-room. I crossed over and picked it up. Then, although braced up for something uncanny or dangerous like a bomb or a snake, I dropped it with a startled cry, for it contained a hand. Just one? There was actually disappointed interest in Warwick's tone. "God, man!" I burst out. "Wasn't that enough to send by post, a dried, fleshless, skinless hand? Imagine Moira opening it, the shock, and this is the awful part of it, finding it to be Mendingham's hand with his signet ring, one she had given him, on the little finger." For the fraction of a second I noticed Warwick wilt. Then he was himself again. "Nothing else inside?" he asked. "Not even the usual printed note or mystic sign?" "Not a line, just the hand and the ring. I got someone to come and stay with Moira, collected the parcel and its gruesome contents, and took them to Scotland Yard. That's all there was to be done. All they could do. There wasn't a fingerprint or clue, though the postmark was Balham. "What next?" Warwick inquired, and I was glad to notice even he was a little subdued. "A week later," I continued, after following his example and emptying my glass, "Moira received another parcel. This one contained the other hand, and Mendingham's fountain pen. His initials were on the gold band, and Moira had no doubts in identifying it. It had been posted in a WC district, and bore the label of a shop at which she had the day before bought some wool, so when she opened it she was not suspicious." "She sent for you?" I nodded. "And you? What did you do?" Warwick asked, with hardly suppressed excitement. "Same as before," I replied, "and the result was the same. No clues." "But she was being watched." Warwick's tone was vibrant. "The rest was easy." "That's what the police thought, but they made a mistake. How could they watch everybody who came into contact with Moira or passed her in a shop, in a train, on a bus? There were 100 people a day to watch. They had to give it up. Moira went away to the country, and for a month, nothing happened. I had to stay in town and, as it chanced, twice met Gregory, but we never mentioned the subject. When Mendingham first disappeared, he had made some quite appropriate remarks, but naturally it wasn't for me to refer to the subject." "Hardly." Warwick offered me a cigarette, and threw away an unlighted one that he had tuned to bits. "Then," I continued, "Moira received a foot by post, the other foot by special messenger. She was nearly mad, and I don't wonder. Then the right forearm, and later the left leg to above the knee, and in each case a little personal belonging of Mendingham's was included, though there was no need for such refinement of cruelty." "Pointing the moral with a vengeance, what?" Warwick said, a little unsteadily. "Exactly. But the last parcel proved too much. Moira collapsed and was taken to a nursing home, and from there to a lunatic asylum, where her one idea is that she is the farmer's wife, her one cry and plea is for a carving knife, and her only exercise running after 3 blind mice." I paused and put my hand up to my eyes. I was fond of Moira, and had once been more than that. For a little while only the thunder rumbled and the lightning cracked, while the rain sizzled down. Then Warwick broke the silence. "Is that all?" he asked. I took my hand from my eyes. "I wish to God it were," I cried. "Do you want the rest?" "You may as well get it off your chest," he answered quietly. "But it's the toughest, saddest story I ever heard." I pulled myself together. There wasn't much more to tell, and I'd get it over and then we could have another drink. Well, from the time Moira went into the nursing home, the parcel stopped coming. She had letters, even in the asylum, but no more gruesome parcels. Suddenly that fact struck me, and the one word revenge blazed into my mind. "Gregory." The word was a breathless whisper from Warwick. "Yes, that's how I saw it. He was cold-blooded, but in a possessive manner he had loved Moira. She and Mendingham had, vulgarly speaking, done him down. He would be revenged on both, a cruel, subtle, lingering revenge. Then came another thought. Was Mendingham by any chance alive? Gregory was a surgeon, one of the cleverest of his day. Mendingham had never been found, and no vital part of his body had been contained in those parcels. Another point in favor of this idea, mad as it seemed, was the lapse of time between the receipt of the parcels. It would have given Mendingham time to get strong enough to bear another operation. That very day I was dining with Gregory, the first meal we'd had together since he had gone abroad. Casually, I noticed that he missed the meat course, but in every other way made a good meal. I referred to Mendingham, but he was merely polite. I mentioned Moira, but he would not be drawn. Then we fell to discussing his book. Over this he became thoroughly enthusiastic and communicative. He waxed emphatic on the morality of those natives, who, he maintained, neither lied nor stole, and who considered adultery the deadliest sin. Murder with them was a just punishment if any crime deserved it. They were, according to him, not immoral but unmoral, and to emphasize the point he referred to a particularly nasty divorce case, which was at the time something of a cause célèbre. In such a case, he began, then suddenly stopped, passed a hand wearily over his head, and went deadly white. After a minute or two he got up, made an excuse about having forgotten an appointment, and hurriedly left the club. I was frankly curious and full of my idea, so I decided to try and follow him. It was a ghastly night, raining hell for leather, thundering and lightning. Like this? Warwick was sitting bolt upright, and his hands gripped his knees so tightly that the knuckles shone white. "Worse," I answered, and went on. I got to the backwater by the houseboat an hour and a half later, and there met a check. Gregory crossed to the far side in a dinghy. I had no means of getting over. It took me half an hour to find a boat and another quarter to row upstream, but eventually I got alongside. In one window, through the gaps of closely drawn curtains, I could see a light. I had no need to go quietly, for the storm drowned all noise. I crept on deck and tried to peer in, but all I could see was an empty corner of a room. Yet I waited, fascinated, glued to the spot. Then I became conscious of a smell, a cooking or roasting smell, and in a lull of the storm I could have sworn that I heard a horrible laugh. I never quite knew how long I waited, but suddenly I became aware of the most severe cramp. I tried to move. My leg refused to support me, and I fell with a crash against the long French window. The latch failed to withstand the shock, and I was pitchforked into the room. In an instant I was on my feet, cramp or no cramp, and was standing face to face with Gregory, who looked like an incarnate fiend. Behind him was an old-fashioned open grate, built in the far side of the houseboat. The fire was burning, a big glowing mass now, and on a huge grid was what I took to be a side or half-side of beef. For a second I paused to moisten my lips. Warwick's face was ghastly to look at, and from his parched mouth he just managed to gasp, "Go on." Without a word, Gregory sprang at me with a huge butcher knife in his hand. Somehow I dodged him and it, and as I sidestepped I struck him with all my force. He fell down, completely stunned. That he was mad, I realized almost at once, almost as quickly as I realized he had something in the houseboat he wished to hide. "What?" "Mendingham," Warwick whispered through trembling lips. For a moment I could not answer. All I was capable of, so acute was memory, was to nod. Then at last I found my voice. That joint roasting over the fire was Mendingham, all that was left of him, his trunk. Hanging from the roof like a round ball of fly-paper was his severed head. God, but it was awful, utter hell. I was sick. Just as I recovered, Gregory came to. He staggered up, first to his knees, then to his feet, laughing and chuckling all the time. He came slowly toward me, while I waited. Nearer he came, nearer, the long knife in his hand. I was frozen with fear and sheer horror. Nearer, 2 more paces, and he slipped in a pool of blood on the floor that had dripped from the newly severed head and fell face downward into the fire. "Yes?" In his excitement, Warwick had clutched both of my wrists, and his eyes were burning into mine. "What next?" I had no time to think, I whispered hoarsely. It was my chance, my life or his, and he was mad and a cannibal. There was no doubt of this. I put my foot on the back of his head and pressed and pressed. Warwick let go my wrists, and a great sigh escaped him. "Good man," he said at last. "You've got pluck. What about the rest? You couldn't leave it at that." "No," I answered, "for my own sake as well as for his." I looked around and found 2 kerosene tins, full. I used them and put a match to the lot. But before doing so, I saw Gregory's book lying open on a table in another room. A passage was underlined. The passage in which he said the only time he found those natives addicted to cannibalism was as a solemn ritual. It was the tribal punishment for adultery, and Warwick put out a hand. "Enough," he said. "For heaven's sake, man, order another drink." The Mist Monster by Granville S. Hoss. The newspaper account stated that Judson McSweet had gone into a cave near his cabin, and in the prevailing darkness wandered too near the brink of a chasm, situated about 500 yards inside the cavern, where he lost his balance or stepped blindly into space and fell to destruction. He may have found his last resting place at the bottom of that pit. I think he did, but not in the manner stated by the newspapers. I'm going to tell you here just what occurred. It will be just a bold statement of facts, which I quite realize will sound much like the dream of a disturbed imagination. McSweet had extended me a standing invitation to spend some time at his place. Well knowing my weakness, he represented the hunting and fishing as excellent, holding out alluring prospects of the sport to be enjoyed. It was long ere I could avail myself of his offer, but finally feeling that my affairs were in such shape that the business could be left with subordinates for a while, I wrote him to expect me early in November. After an all-day journey, I alighted at a small mountain station, where Judson met me with a spring wagon drawn by 1 horse, and in this vehicle, which was already well loaded with bundles, he placed my luggage. "Been stocking up a bit," he explained. "Although there is plenty of fish and game, we can't live on that alone. I like a variety." McSweet was a small man, round and fat, entirely bald, with a cherubic face and mild blue eyes. He was dressed in rough outing clothes, a cap and top boots. He had suddenly retired from business some years before, and bought a small tract of ground with a 2-room cabin where he had since lived alone. In explanation, he had always answered that he preferred being next to nature, that the simple life met all his needs and suited him far better than the more complicated existence of the town or city. As we jolted over the rocky road through the evening gloom, I was surprised by his silence. He had always been a jolly man, full of fun and overflowing with conversation. His face now, as I glanced at him occasionally, seemed set and strained. As we came to a particularly rough stretch of road, the horse stumbled and almost fell. McSweet gave a vicious jerk at the reins and lashed the beast unmercifully, at the same time giving voice to several deep curses. "What on earth is the matter, Mac?" I exclaimed. "You are not yourself at all. I noticed it at the station, and have been marvelling at the change in you ever since." "Oh, it's nothing," he replied. "I'm all right, though I guess the devilish thing has gotten on my nerves a bit." "What thing?" I demanded. "I'll tell you in the morning. Here we are at the shack. We'll soon have a fire going and a supper good enough for your club. Anyway, it will be as substantial as anything they could give you there." He unharnessed the horse, loosing him to range at will, and we soon had the contents of the wagon transferred to the house. After a hearty repast, we sat before the stove with our pipes, while he asked innumerable questions about friends and acquaintances whom he had not seen or heard of since renouncing civilization and settling in the wild spot he now called home. About 10 o'clock, we adjourned to the other room, 2 sides of which were fitted with bunks, while a third was lined with shelves filled with books and magazines. It was apparent how he was in the habit of spending his days and evenings. We were soon occupying the bunks, and I, for one, was not long in falling sound asleep. I arose at dawn, but early as I was, McSweet was up and busied with breakfast. "Ah, Hatton," he exclaimed cheerfully, as I appeared in the doorway armed with rod and creel. "I see we're going to have fish for dinner, but bacon must suffice for breakfast." "Not for dinner," I replied. "I'm going to put up a lunch and make a day of it, but I can promise you some good ones for tonight, if you have not deceived me about how your streams abound with them." We soon breakfasted, and as I prepared to depart, McSweet accompanied me to the door, where he paused, saying, "Hatton, I want particularly to call your attention to that cave you see about 400 yards before us. Keep away from it during the afternoon hours, especially after 3 o'clock, as it is dangerous. The Indians have always lived in great fear of it, and those around here now say that in times past, sacrifices, both human and animal, were made to the thing they believed to dwell in its depths. They call it the Cave of the Wind Devil. I do not know what it is, but I do know that it is something evil and horrible, and to go in there at certain hours is death. The spring from which I get my water is about 10 yards inside the entrance, and I am very careful not to require a supply of it after a certain hour." "But what is it?" I asked. "Surely you must have some good reason for saying what you do, and are not influenced by an old Indian superstition. What do you fear, and what has happened to make you speak so positively of danger?" "Superstition, nothing. No, I am not influenced by the Indian legends, but have good reasons for saying what I do. I'll tell you more this evening, and maybe show you something too, if you return at the right time. But remember what I have said, and keep away from the place." He turned abruptly into the house, and there soon issued a prodigious rattling of pots and pans, indicating that no more information was to be had at that time. Wondering somewhat, I left the cabin, following a path which lay within about 20 feet of the cave, where I paused. The place looked ordinary enough, like hundreds of others to be found in all mountain regions. It may have been the result of what I had just heard, but as I stood gazing into the cavernous depths, I felt a chill creep along my spine, and a sense of deadly fear steal over me. I muttered, "This will never do. Am I letting Mac's wild talk make a fool of me?" Turning in a sort of panic, I hurried on toward the river. It was a fine morning, crisp and cold, with a touch of frost in the air. I pushed forward vigorously through the brambles and other dead growths of summer, and soon reached my destination. McSweet had not exaggerated the abundance of fish, and in a short time my creel contained some fine ones. I built a fire about noon and ate my lunch, which I thoroughly enjoyed, in spite of the fact that it had become quite cold and somewhat dry. About 3 o'clock, I decided to return to the cabin. I had all the fish we could use, and while they were still biting, it seemed a shame to take more from the water than would supply our wants. Drawing near the clearing, I heard loud curses, then shouts, vengeful and gleeful in turn. As I hurried through the trees and around a small hill, a strange sight met my eyes. Judson McSweet was hopping about some distance in front of the cave, and hurling stones into the mouth of it. "Ah, you devil!" he shouted. "How was that? So, you creeping monster, right through you. There, you fiend! And there! And there! And there!" I hurried toward him, my eyes fixed intently on the entrance to the cave. I could see nothing but a grey billowing mist which filled the entire opening. As his missiles disappeared into this mass, a puff of vapour would spurt forth, much in the manner of smoke on the discharge of a gun. These spurts of vapour were accompanied by a horrible odour, a sickening, dead, carrion odour. As I drew nearer, I could feel the same sense of chilly fear steal over me, which I had noticed in the morning. The cloud had by now receded into the depths of the cave, and by the time I reached McSweet, it had entirely disappeared. He stood panting from his exertions, shaking his fist, growling inaudibly. "What on earth is the matter, Mac?" I exclaimed. "Have you gone crazy?" "Did you see it?" he cried. "Oh, the inhuman devouring thing, waiting to draw me into its cold, clammy maw. And listen to it. It is angry and seems to be telling me that some day it will not fail." From the interior of the cavern came a wailing and roaring sound as of a high wind sweeping over a neglected graveyard. "I saw nothing," I replied, "but a cloud of mist. Collect yourself. Why were you throwing stones and acting in such a wild manner?" "That was it, Hatton. What you call mist. But it is not that, no. It is a deadly agency of some sort which destroys and leaves no trace." "Why do you say that? It is true the stuff smelled rather bad, but so far as I could observe, it did not seem capable of much harm. It is probably a mist which rises periodically from some subterranean river." "Mist nothing. No, there is intelligence and power there. During the first months of my stay here, my only companions were a cat and dog. Poor old Tom, it got him. During the hot weather, he was in the habit of sleeping just at the mouth of the cave, where it was cool. One day I was sitting in the door of my cabin when I suddenly heard a number of terrified squalls from the cave. Looking up, I beheld poor Tom, his head and forefeet projecting from the vaporous mass. He seemed to be struggling desperately to get out, but was gradually sucked in. His cries ceased, and the cloud retreated into the cavern. I hastened to the cave, but he was gone. Since then I have seen several small animals disappear in a like manner. First a rabbit, then a fox, and finally a wolf. They had apparently gone to the spring for water." "Remarkable," I exclaimed. "Can it be that the cloud we saw is some sort of poisonous vapor which rises at intervals from the depths of the earth and overcomes whatever living thing it envelops?" "It can't be that, no. A gas of that nature would cause death, but it certainly would not be able to remove the body of the victim. No. This is an intelligent agency of some sort, devilish and deadly. A dog would not fear gas, would it? Well, I had a dog, and after the disappearance of the cat, I noticed what I had failed to observe before, that he would not go within 100 feet of the cave. So one day I took him by the collar and dragged him to the entrance. He whined and struggled desperately, but I persisted, and after getting a few feet within the cave, released him. The poor animal gave one terrified howl and dashed out, disappearing among the trees, and I have seen nothing more of him." "It is certainly strange," I returned thoughtfully. "You say this cloud appears at regular intervals?" "Not exactly, no. It is likely to come out at any time in the afternoon, though I have never seen it before 3 o'clock. We must make a careful investigation. Whatever the phenomenon is, you may be certain it is caused by natural agencies." "I'm afraid any investigation will come to nothing," he answered rather despairingly. "I have just about adopted the Indian belief that the thing is a devil, something superhuman anyway." "Nonsense," I replied. "Come on into the house. I have a fine creel of fish here. Let's give them our undivided attention and resume discussion of this queer thing in the morning." After an excellent repast, we talked and read until bedtime, but without recurring to the thing in the cave. Neither was it mentioned the next day, and as things turned out, it was never mentioned again. I spent the next 3 days hunting and fishing, keeping our table well supplied. As I drew near the cabin on my return the 4th day, I was startled by wild cries and screams from the direction of the cave. "Help! Help! Oh, it's got me! Oh, the cold, clammy devil! Help! Help!" I hurried forward, soon coming to the cave. The grey vapour filled the mouth of the cavern. McSweet's head and shoulders projected from the foggy mass, a look of unutterable fear on his round face. He clawed wildly at the empty air, and it was plain to be seen that he was making desperate efforts to make his way out of the billowing mass, but was apparently held fast. "Courage, Mac!" I shouted. "I'm here!" As I neared him, I brought up my gun, discharging the contents into the grey mass above his head, causing putrid spots of vapour to shoot forth where the charge had entered. Dropping the empty weapon, I rushed forward to seize him by the arms, but my shot seemed to have hastened the end, for he was suddenly enveloped in the cloud, which rapidly retreated into the cave. I got out my flashlight and followed, but all was quiet, and the air clear, though there was a noticeable odour of dead and mouldy matter. I continued forward until I reached what was seemingly the edge of a precipice. My spotlight failed to find the bottom, and stones dropped gave back no sound. I shouted repeatedly, but the echo of my own voice was the only reply. Judson McSweet was gone. I remained at the cabin 2 days longer, hoping against hope. The cloud, now seeming to me ominous and deadly, billowed from the mouth of the cave each day, but I made no attempt to investigate its nature. Of course, I gave no thought to the idea that it was of supernatural origin. Could it be possible, I wondered, for some slimy, horrible monster of the Jurassic Age, or some other period when the world was young, to survive and have its lair in those dark depths? That it came up into the light each day in search of food, and was able to mask its movements by discharging that evil-smelling vapour, much the same as the present-day octopus in the depths of the ocean surrounds itself with an inky blackness when attacked? I wonder. Tzo-Lin's Nightingales by Belitt. All that day it had been raining, a swift, violent onslaught of long drops, slashing sharply upon the face, pelting against the body, seeping down past muffler and topcoat, into the very marrow of one's bones. I have no great affection for autumn rains, especially when they're inclined to spout into malicious pools and overflow into one's overshoes. That is for me the last of the proverbial straws. Accordingly, I sought shelter in the building nearest at hand, a small, unostentatious little shop wedged in securely between two rather dubious hotels. A meagre patch of window glass constituted its front, upon which were painted in red several Chinese characters, and the name Tzo-Lin. My plight had made me desperate, and so, throwing caution and several drops of rainwater from my dripping umbrella to the winds, I turned the carved brass doorknob and entered. Could a snap of my fingers, a mere gesture of my head, have summoned some Nubian genii, ear-ringed and bewhiskered from the depths of my vestcoat pocket, I should have been no whit more startled. I stood with my mouth agape, and with the rainwater trickling from my forehead down my cheek, beading in little drops at my chin, and dropping slowly to the floor, staring dumbly ahead and trying to distinguish between the 1,000 different objects that confused my vision. At first I was aware only of a rich oriental pungency, so acutely sweet and so heavy as to seem almost tangible. It swept through my brain like a fire. I reeled. Then, gradually, my eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and I could make out the innumerable objects arrayed before me. I could discern that the rectangular walls of the shop were lined with long, dark shelves bearing a fragile burden of curios and chefs-d'oeuvre of every type and variety imaginable. Here and there, I could detect the mellowed lambency of bronze and beaten brass and copper, shallow serviettes, long slim vases, fat and contented-looking pots, little clapperless bells hung in ebony belfries. There were rack after rack of figurines wrought in jade and ivory and green marble, upon whose highly polished glaze the light, subdued as it was, flickered in sharp contrasts of oily highlights and smooth, deep purple shadows. There were pewter mugs and slender mirrors and metallic tapestries. There were scimitars and black telescopes with bands of gold encircling their tips. Everything one could think of, or dream of, and even more, was laid away upon those dusty, shadowed shelves. It was as though every people had, in passing, bequeathed some memento to adorn the shop of Tzo-Lin, to help fill his endless rows and stack them more solidly from floor to ceiling, to dream in the warm silence and peace and grow old, hearing the chiming of the many clocks, slowly, sedately, mysteriously old. For despite the overwhelming reek of incense, there was everywhere an odor of age, incalculable age, of must and decay and mystery. I found myself somehow recalling the picture of a ruined Aztec city I had once explored by night, recalling the grey chillness of the moonlight upon those mouldered stones, the horrible heaviness of the black shadows, unmoving as though they had been frozen into that parched soil, and oddly enough, the very same odour of age unfathomable clinging to those bat-infested ruins that now pervaded the shop of Tzo-Lin. And recalling this, I shuddered. By this time, every detail of the shop had grown quite visible, and I could penetrate into the darkest corners. Along the entire extent of the shop, hung from the ceiling with golden cords, placed on low, lacquered tables suspended from every available support, every nook and corner, I could see tiers of bird cages. Within them were discernible little grey shapes that seemed to be nightingales with their wings tightly pressed to their bodies and their heads drooped on their bosoms. Artificial birds, I told myself. A very clever imitation, though. However, my observations were brought to a sudden end, for somewhere in the darkness I heard a soft, slow whisper of slippered feet. I turned my head. The rather emaciated figure of a man in a robe was making its way toward me. This, I hazarded, is Tzo-Lin, and my surmise was correct, for almost before I was aware of it, I found myself staring full into the face of the aged Chinaman. Tzo-Lin was an old man, a gnarled, ancient patriarch with the infinite look of one who had lived 1,000,000 years, and lived them all in vain. Indeed, at my first glimpse of that shrunken, parchment-like face, those unwinking eyes of inexorable learning and wisdom, that yellowed moustache depending in long, fine wisps from either corner of his upper lip, below his meagre shoulders and upon his breast, I wondered if time had not been negligent with his hourglass, and death with his scythe, if they had not, for all their punctilious thoroughness, forgotten one mortal, and forgotten him for a long time. Perhaps the startling contrast of the brilliance of his silken robes with the faded colourlessness of his skin might have exaggerated the man's age. Perhaps. All this occupied my mind for only an instant, and before I could recover sufficient equanimity to murmur an apologetic excuse, Tzo-Lin spoke. The clear freedom of his voice amazed me. I had anticipated a more or less unintelligible mumbling, cracked and thrown out of pitch by the unbelievable senility of the man. Instead, in richest and almost gong-like tones, Tzo-Lin accosted me. 10,000 greetings on your head, in the name of Confucius the Many-Eyed. Perhaps this most despicable of men may be of service to your so enlightened self. I could not have repressed a smile at this naive flow of eloquence, had not there been a distinctly ironic and ingratiating edge to his voice. Immediately I was on my guard, combating fire with fire. I bowed deeply, and countered by asking his hospitality in the lengthiest and most sonorous diction I could muster. A ghost of a smile hovered for a moment about Tzo-Lin's lips and vanished. He returned my bow with imperturbable dignity, and indicated the little fireplace at the rear of his shop with a slow nod of his head. I made my way thence through the dim aisles of dusty bric-a-brac. Behind me walked Tzo-Lin, serenely, lightly as a girl, fluttering his ivory fan. I found the fire, for all its minuteness, to be quite satisfying and congenial. I sat on one side of it, luxuriously toasting my chilled knees before its pleasant warmth. Tzo-Lin sat on the opposite side on a little lacquered bench and stared into the fire, as oblivious of my presence as though I had not been there. For a time we both remained thus, hearing the flames crackle, the fresh wood hiss and splutter, the clocks ticking off the seconds, and the rain pattering softly, monotonously, unceasingly upon the roof. In the end, several questions that had been rankling in my mind forced me to break the silence. I could not help noticing how very natural those artificial nightingales are that you have all around. You made them yourself, I suppose? Tzo-Lin smiled and shook his head. A sort of contemplative dreaminess crept into his voice. He said, "No, how could I? The birds, the nightingales, are not artificial." And he resumed his reverie. I laughed his words aside. Come, my dear man. I am no prospective customer. You can be perfectly frank with me, and quite truthful." The old Chinaman seemed to be speaking in a dream. "I said they were real nightingales, and I repeat what I said. They are as much alive as you and I, only they have been sleeping." I strove to conceal my contempt for what I knew to be an untruth. "Sleeping?" I asked. "And pray, for how long?" The man's lips scarcely moved. 300 years ago. They were my wife's betrothal gift from her husband." I drew my breath sharply. What pleasure did this man derive in doling me out such preposterous nonsense? I took no pains to repress my contempt now. "And when, dear sir, will they awake?" "They will awake on the night of the full moon, on the night when my bride will return to me for an hour, from the purple halls of the dead." His voice sank into a whisper. It was quite enough. I arose from my seat and grasped the Chinaman by the shoulder. "What sort of fool do you take me for?" I began. "Perhaps—" Tzo-Lin cut me short with a steady glance. Very slowly he rose, as if in a daze, removed my hand from his person, and spoke with a keen deliberateness. "I will not have doubted, my friend. If it is your pleasure, you may come and see for yourself on the night of the full moon. Meanwhile, it will please me to have you leave." Again he sank down into his seat, opened his fan, and stared into the fire as though he saw— what? Despite my resentment of this indignity, I had sufficient presence of mind to do as I was bid. I left, clanging the door shut with a reverberating report that set the brassware trembling and made the china tinkle, leaving the silence and the warmth and the solitude of the shop for Tzo-Lin's sole enjoyment. That month the full moon came with a vivid silverness that dominated the entire length and breadth of the sky. It came floating up out of the darkness of the city, and hung in space like a vast bubble of ice just about to burst, with a transparent mist of cloud scud clustered about it. On the ground, the snow, soft as a new-shorn fleece, lay several inches thick, stretching away on every hand to a wilderness of pearl and diamond, and a low sky flushed to a dull mauve, as though it had been afire. There were a few flakes tumbling about in a rather lazy fashion when I first set out, but when I had finally reached the tiny lozenge of a shop bearing Tzo-Lin's name, I found myself shouldering through nothing less than a blizzard. My coat flapped and cracked in the wind like a banner, and my umbrella was blown inside out. Hurling the tattered wreckage of the latter into the darkness, I opened the narrow door and entered. I was fairly catapulted inside by the violence of a savage gust that lifted the innumerable rugs and carpets from the floors and blew out the tapestries up on the walls like sails. I shook the snowflakes from my person and made my way back into the rear of the little shop to where the cheerful fire snapped on the hearth. There was a little recess I had not before noticed adjoining the rear compartments, a sort of niche sheltering a gilded idol mounted on a low pedestal of ebony, and lighted on either side by a pair of smoking joss-sticks. As I stood, silently looking on, the overwhelming reek of a composite incense smote my nostrils again, this time more heavy and nauseating than ever. I coughed. The old Chinaman looked up from his devotions, motioned me to be seated, and then resumed his prayers. Having no other alternative, I obeyed and soon gave myself up to the magic of watching the yellow flames that leaped and fell, and shod in pale blue slippers ran swift little races across the brown logs. And in the small alcove, Tzo-Lin went on praying to his pagan gods, tearing into bits the scarlet prayer paper. And so the minutes passed on. Then, when I had almost drowsed off into sleep, the hour struck, slowly, deliberately, portentously. The heavy silence that followed lay like a weight upon my brain, seemed to pour a tide of whirring soundlessness into my ears. I gasped for breath, and waited for whatever might happen, my glance riveted up on the little cages that thronged the shop. At first, all I saw was the quivering of a cage, and then of many cages. Then I could hear the brushing and thrashing of innumerable wings, and finally, to climax the entire inexplicable occurrence, a clear, shrill chirp cut the air like a tiny knife thrust, soared upward, a silver skyrocket of sound, burst into a sudden confusion of trills, and spent itself, gradually, softly, like a shower of many-coloured sparks. Almost immediately, before I could force myself to realize it, before I was even aware of it, the hundreds of little cages all about were swinging violently to and fro, with their tassels waving frantically like yellow hands. And of a sudden there arose such a burst of song, such a passion of mad sweet music, that I felt my very body must crumble like a liquid beneath it, and melt and be lost, quietly, into the turning vortices of that consecrated air. It seemed impossible that such perfect, rounded harmony could come from the throat of any bird in such rapid and faultless succession. Fascinated and half-reeling, I watched the nightingales. Their entire bodies seemed to shimmer and tremble in the ecstasy of their music. Each tiny throat so swelled and puffed and quivered that I marveled how, like some bubble overweighted with air, they did not suddenly burst. The whole shop was afire with their singing. The room seemed somehow to grow 100 times more sweeping and spacious. Each wall seemed to have been thrust back, and the ceiling cloven from its supports by some gigantic hand, leaving nothing but the broad and open blueness of heaven about it. The shop, strangely, unaccountably, seemed to fill with mist and vague vapours, twisting and rolling upward, with all the grotesque quietness of a nightmare. Dimly, then was borne to my ears the tireless chanting of Tzo-Lin, and his voice, triumphant and exalted into something as beautiful and intolerable as the nightingale's flood of song, was full of love, as though he spoke to someone immeasurably dear to him, as though he addressed a bride. I gave a great cry and rose to my feet. I shall never know what took place in the few moments that followed. A blackness, like the shadow of an enormous arm, seemed suddenly to creep out of the corners, to mount steadily like a flow of dark water, while down from the roof and ceiling fell silence, fold on fold, loop on loop, stilling the crying of the birds, choking the loud surge of my own pulse beats. More I cannot remember, but the horror, the incredible madness of the waking hour, that will be with me always. I think it was the cold that first aroused me. I recall shuddering with an extreme violence that made my teeth knock. Then my shoulder struck something sharp, and I awoke. A single glance above me, ahead of me, over my shoulder, and I leaped to my feet, shaking and shrieking for terror with all the strength of my lungs. Where once shelf upon shelf had borne up 1,000 odds and ends of brasses and statuary, many compartments layered with dust and cobwebs glowered emptily out of the darkness. The ceiling had fallen through at irregular intervals, and 6 or 7 of the blackened beams strewed the floor, straddling the breadth of the room diagonally, like prone colossi. On every joint and cornice the spiders had woven heavily, and, as if to reinforce their workmanship, a dust like pumice powder had settled on every thread and clotted. But more than this, more than the horror of dust and spiders, it was the swift glimpse of the 2 figures in the rear of the room that left me weak and tortured with a terrible unrest for so many months after. 2 figures, and I saw them just at the moment the trapdoor over my head was lifted, in response to my insane pummelings. I had heard the scrape of feet somewhere above me, and guessed myself to be in a cellar of some sort. 2 figures, one a man, the other a woman, both in glittering, flower-painted robes, lying with phosphorescent pallor and green horror on their faces, arms interlocked and veiled over 3 times with cobwebs, while cage after cage, each holding a single brown figure like a bird within it, glimmered silently in a wide circle above their heads. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.